Lavender Literary Society members and guests, good evening and welcome. Tonight, we are honored to present Margaret Vandenburg's book, Craze. In this sharp and compelling work, Vandenburg draws from deeply researched queer history to craft a vivid, irreverent narrative set in the Roaring Twenties that pulses with wit, desire, and defiance. Through rich historical detail and imaginative storytelling, Craze resurrects hidden worlds and forgotten lives, offering a dazzling exploration of queer culture, community, and survival. My name is Suhaili Bautista. I'm the Chief of Programs at the American LGBTQ Museum, a new cultural institution dedicated to preserving, researching, and sharing LGBTQ history and culture. Our vision is a world where all people experience the joy of queer liberation. I am a brown-skinned Black woman. I'm wearing gold-framed glasses, brown lipstick, and Black box braids. And I'm happy to be here tonight. And while our first physical galleries are still a few years into the future, our work as a museum is already underway. Over the past 3 years, we have produced a robust slate of free public programming with partners across the country, toured an award-winning exhibition to 5 major US cities, and then launched our Lavender Literary Society book club, which you get to experience this evening. When we open our doors as New York City's newest museum, we will tell the stories of queer people across time, place, and identity. The museum will be a space for celebration, remembrance, and connection, a place where queer magic is real, our ancestors are honored, and our stories are told with power and pride. But you don't have to wait until 2028 to be part of our story. You can join us now through public programs like this one, traveling exhibitions, our newsletter, our book club, or by becoming a founding member. Every gift of support, every act of visibility helps build this museum from the ground up. And you can learn more about the American LGBTQ Museum at americanlgbtqmuseum.org. For those of you joining the Lavender Literary Society for the first time, we'd like to begin by sharing a bit about our book club. The American LGBTQ Museum's book club is a space for community and connection, bridging generations through the magic of storytelling. Our titles are a mix of popular queer history, fiction, memoir, with inspiring authors and iconic guest facilitators. Through virtual and in-person gatherings, we aim to ignite intergenerational dialogue and foster understanding, empathy, and unity. Together, we traverse the landscapes of queer culture, savoring the nuances and complexities that make our stories uniquely ours. This isn't just a book club. Reading together is a powerful act, a catalyst for change, and a testament to the resilience of the LGBTQ spirit. Participants will be a part of something extraordinary. And in this book club, we won't just read, we'll weave the threads of our stories into a tapestry of strength, resilience, and pride. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's author. Margaret Vandenburg is a novelist, playwright, and essayist whose books include Craze, a jazz age portrait of queer New York, shortlisted for the 2024 Sarton Award, An American in Paris, a romp through the sapphic salons of Gertrude Stein and Natalie Barney, The Home Front, the story of a family facing autism, and Weapons of Mass Destruction, an Iraq War Requiem. Her plays include Roe v. Wade 2.0, the centerpiece of a theater-based reproductive rights coalition, and Belly of the Beast, a finalist from the Drama League Award for Outstanding Digital Theater. Having completed her PhD in English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, Vandenburg spent her academic career as a senior lecturer at Barnard College, specializing in modernism, postmodernism, and gender studies. She lives in the Hudson Valley, a stone's throw from New York City. And I'd like to welcome tonight's moderator. Monica L. Miller is chair and professor of Africana Studies at Barnard College, Columbia University. A specialist in contemporary African American and Afro-diasporic literature and cultural studies, she is the author of the book Slaves to Fashion, Black Dandyism and the Styling of Black Diasporic Identity, which inspired Superfine, Tailoring Black Style, the 2025 Costume Institute exhibit at the Met. A frequent commentator in the media and arts worlds, she teaches and writes about Black literature, art, and performance, Fashion, Cultures, and Contemporary Black European Culture and Politics. Please join me in welcoming Margaret and Monica to the virtual stage.
Hi, Margaret.
Hey.
I am Monica Miller, and I am very delighted to be here with my colleague and friend, Margaret Vandenburg. And I am a brown-skinned Black woman with short black curly hair, and I am sitting in my office, which is full of books. Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Monica. I feel like we've been waiting, or I have been, to have this conversation for about 2 decades.
I know.
So here we are.
Here we are, and it is very, very exciting.
And
So,
I am just a quick description.
Yep.
I'm relatively tall, even when I'm sitting down. A white woman, brown eyes, brown hair, graying a little bit here and there, wearing glasses, which I'll probably take on and off. And I'm sitting at home in my office at home.
Okay, welcome everyone. We are excited to get this conversation started. I feel like we have had pieces of this conversation over the last 25 years or so. But this is the first time that we're able to have a conversation about your incredible book, like kind of dig into it in a specific place. So I have some questions prepared, but we're also going to try to, riff a little bit. So, but I'm going to start with my first prepared question. Okay. So, Craze, this incredible book, opens with Henry or Henrietta, a journalist who is covering modern art, and she has just moved from Paris to New York, right? On her first day in the city, she meets a new friend, Crystal, who's a drag queen from Long Island, and Crystal takes her to a speakeasy. There, they witness a performance by, is it Jean?
It depends if you want to be Frenchy or not.
Okay, I'm gonna be American
Should we be
about it.
American? Let's do that.
Let's be American about it. Jean Malin, who you describe as, quote, the mouthpiece of the Roaring Twenties, giving voice to the zeitgeist of the times. So you give me a little bit of setup, right? Why is it important for Henry to meet Crystal and Jean at the opening of the novel?
So also wanted to just thank everybody at the museum, Lucy and Suhaili in particular, because we're so happy to be here. Thank you.
Yes.
So she's just come from Paris, and it's probably the premier moment of lesbian history over there with Natalie Barney and Gertrude Stein in these wonderful salons. And she sort of got kicked out because she was too political, in effect. She was insufficiently kind of pushing away this very important historical moment, which you and I will be talking about, where there's these echoes, unfortunately, of the rise of fascism. Right. So she comes to New York, having thought in some ways that would have been the heyday of her life. And when she arrives, somewhat disappointed then, she meets Crystal, and she really needs a kind of guide. She doesn't understand that this queer craze is happening in New York. She doesn't understand that in some ways, Sappho has moved to New York, if you like. And so Crystal is her guide to this queer craze. And I call it the queer craze rather than the pansy craze, because the original name in some ways writes lesbians out of history. And so the book is about trying to write us back in. At the same time, having said that, Crystal has this mercurial and shape-shifting gender fluidity that she really hasn't experienced yet. And even in Paris, she hasn't experienced it. So that's the importance really of Crystal, is to sort of introduce this, whether Crystal is, when you read the book, you have to sort of decide, is Crystal a drag queen, is Crystal a transvestite, is Crystal trans woman? Right. And that particular historical moment, these things had, they have somewhat different valences, but it's perhaps more of a real question in the novel because it's set in the 1920s.
Right.
And eventually, Crystal will become a kind of potential model, along with another character in the book, who is another shapeshifter. We'll get to her later, but as to whether or not somehow Henry can figure out who she is.
Right.
as it with reference to gender.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one little sort of giveaway at the very beginning in the first chapter, Crystal's sitting on the stoop, and she's not dressed up at the moment,
Right.
but she jumps up, and I'll just read a tiny bit.
Sure.
Um,
That's great.
the mere thought of Paris activated the camp equivalent of her adrenal gland, the source of an irrepressible burst of glam. Crystal's hair was cropped short, less a fashion choice by day than a way of accommodate wearing wigs by night. She might as well have been coiffed like a queen, given the way she held her head. It was a magical metamorphosis, like witnessing a chrysalis birthing a monarch butterfly. And this is the important part.
Yeah.
The sidewalk was her royal runway.
Mm-hmm.
Then, as abruptly as she leapt up, she sat down again. The show was over, at least for now. And the reason I thought that was important for us is that you and I are really interested in the performance of gender and race.
Mm-hmm.
So it's already unclear whether Crystal is performing or not, and what does that even mean?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the things that I think is really powerful about this book, and that also really grounds it in its time, right? When we think about the 1920s, right, there is this moment. I mean, it's really important. It's like, I do this when I'm teaching, and I'm sure you do too. It's really important to sort of get people into to really move people into the period, really like necessitates that people are really thinking differently, right? About gender, about sexuality, right? And to a certain extent, when I think about it, not necessarily in terms of the queer craze, but like when the queer craze intersects with the Harlem Renaissance, like there's also a lot of questions there about race and class that come into it too, right? So it's this really fascinating moment, right? In New York specifically, right? But in general, where performances of gender, where there's just a different set of a different set of a different set of parameters, right? So can you tell me a little bit more about Jean, right? In that, in how does his performance? Because when after Henry meets Crystal, right, they go to the speakeasy, and it seems to me that those two things, meeting Crystal, right, and having this sort of fluidity, performance question come up, and then going to the speakeasy, right? And what happens there that's also really important for Henry at the beginning of the novel.
Right. And I hope that we can sort of segue this into, Jean Mallon is wearing a tuxedo.
Right. Let's talk about the tuxedo.
Right. And we'll talk about the tuxedo, and then also, Monica's, I mean, one of the reasons we're sort of doing this together in particular is Monica's book about dandies, and that to think about the politics of the dandy, which changes over time, but we're in the 20s, like you say.
Right.
And then the role of the tuxedo. And so in the case of Jean Mallon was described, and these are these premier, queer performers,
right,
in the speakeasies of the 1920s. And he was described really as a kind of male impersonator, not a female impersonator. So already you're beyond, expectations. You're already upside down 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
And so just, I sometimes let the novel speak for itself. So this is Jean.
Okay.
He's a huge man, 6 feet tall, built like a pugilist, simultaneously cocky and effeminate, wearing his tuxedo, not in drag, but he's straddling the gender divide, which I think is what you say in Slaves to Fashion, is really what, in some ways, the important thing above all about the dandy. So there's a way in which we certainly wouldn't talk about in those terms 100 years later.
No.
And what he represents then is this, sort of pushing back against a kind of what has become a stereotypical idea of a drag queen.
Hmm.
And the role of the tuxedo, which I hope you'll sort of frame, because I think
Yeah.
you've worked a lot on that,
Hmm.
is used very much differently, I think, by Gladys Bentley. And maybe you'd want to introduce what you think about that relationship
Hmm.
between the two, Jean Mallon and Gladys Bentley.
Yeah, I mean, the tuxedo for me, and or its relationship, the tuxedo for me is this really fascinating garment, right? And particularly at this period of time, like when I talk about the tuxedo, I'm always thinking about it as, if you go to any kind of fancy function, right, and particularly in the 20s, right, the entertainment is wearing a tuxedo, the people serving, right, are wearing tuxedos, and people attending are wearing tuxedos, right? So there's a way that occupying the garment, right? I mean, the garment is this really kind of it's not a neutral space, I don't think, but it is a space to be occupied. It is a garment to be performed. Like it can be an element of disguise, right? It can also be an element of revelation, right? So it's this garment that has this real potential movement. On the other hand, right, when Jean is wearing the tuxedo, on the one hand, it's an expected garment for a person in his position, right? He's a man, and he's also um, performing, right, to a certain degree, but he's not performing it right, right? I mean, in some ways, he's not doing it, or he's doing it right. I mean, he's doing it right for his own purposes, right? But it's not a typical performance, right, inside of that garment. A person like Gladys Bentley, an incredibly well-known Black woman blues singer from the same time period, who was very famous for wearing she's most famous for wearing a white tuxedo, right? But she wore tuxedo she wore also a standard, more typical tuxedo, right? Gladys is also, when she puts on the tuxedo, she's both wearing it right, right? Because she was also a kind of commanding figure, right? But she's in the tuxedo, right? She's on the one hand, right, taking a certain form of masculine power that comes with that garment, masculine power, right? That comes with that garment. But then also in terms of the way she uses it to sing the blues, right? And her blues songs were often really bawdy and about her as a lesbian, about her same-sex desire, about in some ways the a circulation of desire, right? Again, she doesn't use the garment, or she does use the garment, right, as a kind of tool, right? To as you were talking about shape shifting, right? As a mode of shape shifting and a mode sort of around, right? Expectations of femininity, expectations of masculinity, expectations of heterosexuality, homosexuality, class to a certain extent. Like we don't know when somebody's wearing a tuxedo, like what's their actual class position, right? So there's a lot going on when somebody puts on a tuxedo, especially in the 1920s, I would say, right? So when Henry comes into that environment, meets Crystal, right, and then goes with Jean, right, we really get this, she steps into a space, right, where a lot of things are possible. Yeah.
Right. I think eventually we may not have time, but the
Yeah.
sort of what we're moving towards possibly in history, 100 years down the line, but certainly in the novel, you talked about, I think, the tuxedo is a kind of leveler in a way, but
Yeah.
above all, it's movement, you said.
Yes.
And so what I mean by that in this novel is the language of the novel is that it's a gender in motion.
Yeah.
And the important thing to me as we go along, because of what's happening today, 100 years later, is to figure out
Hmm.
what in some ways are the most radical forms of what they called androgyny. We don't call it that anymore. It's very out of fashion,
Right.
that term. But androgyny is a very powerful thing in this particular moment. We'll talk about Virginia Woolf in a minute, I know. But I think I agree that the tuxedo is really a kind of emblem of that gender in motionness.
Right.
And one of the things that you talk about in Slaves to Fashion, which I think happens in the Gladys Bentley scene. So this is later, and she's in the Clam House in Harlem.
Right.
And Henry's there. Henry has two lovers during the course of the novel. One of them is the shapeshifter that I mentioned before her, and she goes from being the python to sort of an ordinary woman, which we'll talk about. And the other
Mhm.
one is this Upper East Side socialite. And
Right.
in this scene with Gladys Bentley at the Clam House, she's with the socialite. And the reason I came back to Slaves to Fashion is that I think you talk about the relationship between the audience and the performance.
Mhm.
And when Gladys performs at, I won't read this now because I think we've got a lot of ground to cover, but
Mhm.
when she performs at the Clam House, there's this clamorous group of bulldaggers
Right.
who are, you use the word masculine. It's interesting because they're described as flagrantly masculine, but
Right.
in a different context, what they are is androgynous, and androgyny is not about masculinity. It's about sort of the absence
Right.
in some ways of that. But the important thing being that she has this profound impact on
Mhm.
the audience, so that the tuxedo and everything that we're talking about actually has the capacity to change everything, everybody in
Yeah.
the room, and by extension, everybody in Harlem, we wish perhaps, or everybody in New York, or everybody in the country,
Right.
or everybody
Right.
wherever. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I mean, one of the ways that I talk about in the book that we don't have to go into, but is what I'm interested in when you talk about that sort of movement. I'm also very interested in what happens, like in some ways, between the garment, right, and somebody's skin. Right. That's where I feel like the movement really is. And I feel like in that scene where Gladys Bentley is performing, it's in some ways like that space gets that the excitement or the possibility of that space is something that kind of takes up the whole room, right? Yeah, yeah,
Right, and skin then by extension being, I like that a lot. That then you're getting to the body itself, and
yes,
does that performance? I mean, there's so many ways to theorize this, which we won't. But does that performance actually have an effect on the body,
on the body,
and on,
right?
not just on, in some ways, not just on the gender identification of the person, but the person themselves,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
which is a very profound possibility.
yeah. And I think that's what I think that's what is interesting to me, right, about those blues women and those performances, right, is in some ways like what happens when they step off the stage, right, and then what happens when people go home. Like there was an enormous tolerance, right, for these very, very provocative um, performances, right, by blues women, by queer blues women, by blues men, right? And the tolerance for those or the desire for them at this moment in time is really fascinating. So I want to ask you a question then about one of the ways that we meet, right? Is is around this sort of concept, right? As literary scholars, right? Is around this concept of modernism, right? And the modern. So what's happening with Henry, or if she steps out of Paris, but she steps into New York. So she steps into the queer craze, she steps into the jazz age, she steps into the Harlem Renaissance, right? She steps into all like this kind of conflagration of movements, right? So let's say a little bit about modernism, right? And bringing in the things that we were just talking about, right? And to think about like what's important, or how did you get to this book, right? From, in some ways, some of the things that you've been, thinking about and teaching for a long time.
Yeah, so the modernism moment, um, it's not just between the wars, but it is that really there's this horrific sort of historical cataclysm all around the modernists, and I think they're responding to that in some ways, in dangerous ways. And I think I mentioned this earlier, where she leaves Paris because part of the modernist aesthetic, some of them,
Mhm.
is to sort of pretend that art is this, ivory tower floating aesthetic
Mhm.
enterprise, and she wants no part of that because we'll see, and I'll do a little quoting from especially Virginia Woolf here. It leads potentially to fascism in their estimation, and when I say that, there's sort of two branches of modernism in my understanding of it, and everybody has a different modernism.
Mhm.
I guess in a minute we can talk about, whether you think there's a parallel modernism happening with the Harlem Renaissance and modernism itself, and that if they're sort of inextricable, and
Sure.
if they are in some ways the same thing or not.
Hmm.
In my version of it, there's the traditional and the radical modernists, and the traditional modernists manifesto is written, I think, by T.S. Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent, and he talks about how you have to become the mouthpiece of tradition, and that genius is really letting tradition speak through you. And so there's a kind of erasure of the personal, he says.
Hmm.
And it's a tradition that is definitely handed down from father to son. It's almost an Oedipal model of canonicity.
Right.
Woolf comes along and says, I'm going to be the mouthpiece of the radical modernists. And she writes her manifesto in a room of one's own. And that's what I'm going to quote from, because that's the important thing.
Yeah.
And she basically says, if you write like the traditional modernists, you're going to end up with fascism, but I'll let her say it. So she says this is a room of one's own. If one is a man, and people are acquainted with this because she's famous for androgyny.
Hmm. Hmm.
If one is a man, still the woman part of the brain must have effect, and a woman must also have intercourse with the man in her. Coleridge perhaps meant this when he said that a great mind is androgynous. And then she goes on to say that Shakespeare was sort of the quintessential androgynous writer.
Yeah.
She says, continuing, for one can hardly fail to be impressed in Rome by the sense of unmitigated masculinity. So she's dissing the Eliot model.
Right.
And whatever the value of unmitigated masculinity upon the state and in art, one may question the effect of it upon the art of poetry.
Hmm.
Poetry ought to have a mother as well as a father.
Mm.
The fascist poem, one may fear, will be a horrid little abortion such as one sees in a glass jar in the museum of some county town.
Hmm.
So she's bringing politics back into it.
Hmm.
And she's pushing back very hard. As you well know, Ezra Pound ended up on fascist radio exemplifying her thesis. And in his words, you see how he got there, because he thought that art was produced and that creativity came from, now I'll quote him, Ezra Pound, man really the phallus or spermatozoid charging head on the female chaos. Even oneself has felt it driving any new idea into the great passive vulva of London. And then just one more thing about the
Yeah.
traditional radical, that's the gender war of it all.
Yeah. Yes.
But there's also sort of a form and content thing. And I think this is relevant to the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the things that Suhaili mentioned when we were setting up our evening was that it dovetailed with the New York Historical Exhibition of the Gay Harlem Renaissance. And I think this is relevant to that, to the extent to which, the Harlem Renaissance was or wasn't more politically sort of self-conscious,
Hmm.
than this side of modernism, the traditional side of modernism. And that traditional side is, in some ways, the content isn't new. I mean, Pound said,
Right.
make it new, but that's the formal experimental side of it.
Mhm.
Whereas the content, like you think of James Joyce, for example, writes
Yeah.
Ulysses, he's remaking the Odyssey. Or you think of Freud, which is very important in the modernist period, who's, goes back to the Oedipus complex. So there's this tension in modernism, I think, and we could probably apply that to this moment where you mentioned you've got this sort of confluence of the Jazz Age and the Harlem Renaissance and modernism.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think within the Harlem Renaissance, there's some similarities and some differences, right? I mean, in terms of the traditionalists versus the radical folks, I mean, some of that in the Harlem Renaissance is kind of generational, right? But I do think that the politics of it, it's not that the older generation in the Harlem Renaissance want politics out of art. They want a specific politics with the art, right? That the younger generation, and we're thinking older generation might be somebody like Du Bois or W.E.B. Du Bois, Alain Locke, although Locke moved around. But the younger generation, people like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, County Cullen, Wallace Thurman, a kind of queer coterie, right, of artists there. They were interested actually in in a kind of form of art that not that it was apolitical at all, but the politics would come in some ways after the artist reached a kind of reached a mode of liberation, right? Was able to sort of like self-express in a way that didn't have boundaries, right? And that was outside of binaries, right? So the politics in some ways were baked into, right? Uh, were baked into the form, right? And then sometimes the content, right? So those folks were really friends of Wolf, right? And that they were really very much about sometimes androgyny, certainly queerness, like I mean, political androgyny, political queerness, that kind of thing. Sometimes about that, but also just really about championing the sort of like championing art that reflects the actual way that people live, right? Um, but I want to go back to one of the things because we're talking about modernism as a movement, right? But one of the other things that happens in your novel, and this is really important, is that Henry is an art journalist, right? So she does that work in Paris, right? And you're in the earlier novel, right? An American in Paris. But she's trying to sort of make her way as a writer about art in New York City. And she's managing she's managing something like what Wolf is managing, right? A kind of like older guard of male modern artists, right? But her goal the whole time is to get an interview with Georgia O'Keeffe, right? So I want to know, I mean, again, if it's really important that she meets Crystal and Jean at the beginning, right? Her whole quest in some ways, right, is for Georgia O'Keeffe. So what is that about? Like, why is she just insistent? I mean, there's clearly certain things that she wants to write about with Georgia, but she also just wants to meet her, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible to say, I want to use
Okay,
what you said at
right.
the end
Roll us back.
to get to her, which is
Yeah,
that when you said outside of the binaries and
yeah,
reference to Harlem Renaissance, you know, in some ways, I don't. Modernism failed miserably because and it even implicates itself in the rise of fascism, with
hmm
what I was trying to say, and that so you're going to have to get postmodernism, and that's what postmodernism is. Postmodernism is literally when you finally get outside of the boundaries. But
hmm
within modernism and the way you describe the Harlem Renaissance, you have the radical modernists who are already
Yeah,
moving outside of it.
right.
And then androgyny, as you said, becomes a kind of metaphor for that, thinking outside of and writing outside of
hmm
binaries, and that it's this as you said, it's a mode of liberation. So, I mean, that's for her. That's Georgia
For Henry.
O'Keeffe. I mean,
Yeah.
Georgia O'Keeffe might even be called a dandy in some ways, the way
hmm
that she dresses.
Yeah.
And she's certainly androgynous, but they keep trying to this older generation of writers and artists that she has to get through to get to Georgia
hmm
O'Keeffe. She has to go through the Stieglitz coterie, and
Right.
famously Georgia O'Keeffe married Stieglitz and
hmm
is seen as sort of somebody whose career was made through the great Stieglitz. And clearly, this is something that she's going to write against.
hmm
And in part of that problem is the idea that she was somehow mentored by Stieglitz. Is this idea, and it goes back to Eliot, that we're taught to read in particular ways. We have to write in particular ways, and we have to read in particular ways, and that those ways are anything but androgynous. So
hmm
what she is doing is that she wants to write the real Georgia O'Keeffe. And I'm going to read a passage. This is
Okay. Yeah.
um, about Georgia's paintings, not so much her presentation, her androgynous presentation. But, famously, again, Georgia O'Keeffe painted flowers. And
Mhm.
everyone was sort of, oh, yeah, the lady's painting
Yeah.
flowers.
hmm
And this is a passage that's reflecting why Henry was so interested in writing about and meeting Georgia O'Keeffe and what her art really means.
hmm
Everybody, this is from the novel then. Everybody had read A Room of One's Own by then, Woolf's portrait of the androgynous wellspring of creativity. By everyone, I don't mean Alfred Stieglitz, the husband, and Mr. C, and that's the editor of the
Right.
journal that she's working with,
Mhm.
who both still read Freud. Steeped in particular aesthetics, those two misunderstood the symbolic sensuality of O'Keeffe's flower paintings. Had Stieglitz read Woolf, he never would have written that, and he really did write this. The woman receives the world through her womb, a direct quotation from one of his exhibition catalogs. Since when was the womb the site of female pleasure, Alfred? Are wombs really in the folds of O'Keeffe's flower petals, or something more akin to Gladys Bentley's boy in the boat, aka the clitoris? For the record, fellas, all those pistils and stamens aren't phallic symbols. Far from representing masculinity, they're the other half of an androgynous whole, a botanical wedding of oppositions. Plato's androgynes come to mind, the first expression of this erotic I'm ideal. I'm getting all hot and bothered just thinking about it, aren't you? She's addressing the reader. So
Yeah.
that's the
Mhm.
appeal.
Yeah. So wait a minute, oppositions, right? I want to talk about oppositions. So Henry eventually has two, as you mentioned before. She has two lovers, right? The Python, right? And Constance. So how does and they're different, they are very different, right? So how are they figured, right, as part of this opposition for Henry, right? And how does she sort of, she's very cathected to one at the beginning and then kind of flips to the other at the end, right? So let's talk about that transition.
Yeah, so this is a strange kind of, she has a problem basically with when she's sort of really cathected to the Upper East Side socialite. And the problem is that I think, just in short, that there's a kind of internalized homophobia potentially. Having
Mhm.
said that, she's a very sexy femme woman.
Mhm.
But the reason I said there's an internalized homophobia is that Henry has to work through all of these kind of scripted understandings of desire. And
Right.
the most scripted desire of all, in a kind of terrifying way,
Yeah.
is actually Constance's body, and here's a case where, and I won't read the passage, but it's very vivid in terms of saying that,
Mm.
her sexuality has really imprinted itself. You mentioned skin. I mean, on her skin, on her body, and to the extent that Henry, who's never been with a woman like her before, really says that I've never seen a body like this. And what this body, even though she's been with women, what the body is above all is kind of penetrable. There's a kind of vulnerability that is on the one hand really erotic, but on the other hand kind of unsettling. And in the long run, she's gonna transcend that desire and get to the Python, who's also scripted at the beginning. She's this, sort of Byronic, Heathcliff-esque,
Leather
scripted,
person.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Yeah.
Also very scripted.
Hmm.
And then she starts to shed, and
Right.
this is a question because it may not be possible, but she starts shedding all of that scriptedness, that sexy, leatheriness.
Hmm.
And underneath it all is, and this is a question, it's, I don't, like I said, I don't know if it's possible, but underneath it all, there's an ordinariness, as the word is
Yeah.
used, but also
Mhm.
that there is this possibility that the acting may have fallen away. And that's why I say
Right.
maybe it's not possible, because
Yeah.
if gender is performance,
Yeah.
and we don't have time to, I suppose, to talk about racial and gender performance, but is it desirable, or is it even possible to actually get to a place where you're not performing anymore? And what would that mean?
Hmm. Hmm. No, that's a great question. I love that as a kind of problematic for the novel because um, the Python is an actor, right? Starts off as an actor, and when she becomes ordinary, right? I mean, I don't know. I mean, when you ask the question about whether or not you ever stop performing, maybe there comes a moment when the performance is not spectacle, right? Or where the performance is made up of sort of, we talked a little bit about Judith Butler before this, right? But in her theories of gender performance, but when the performance becomes a kind of a little bit of a ritual that doesn't have that spectacularity associated with it, right? I wonder about that too. I think that's a really interesting way. When you talked about the fact that Henry is working through scripts, right, and that some of the women that she's, especially these two important women that she's interacting with, that they are also in some ways scripted and becoming unscripted. That is, I think that's such a beautiful way to understand what happens through the arc of the novel, right? And that is why, and this is my other question for you, that is why there are two other places in the novel that are really important, right? One of them is the Hamilton Lodge Ball, right? Hamilton Lodge Drag Ball, which originates in Harlem, eventually it takes place in other places in the city, right? And then also Coney Island, right? These are two sort of, for the time period, two iconic things that are really different ways of thinking about the scripts, right? And their undoing, right? So I love that those places are here and really important places where, Henry's getting more information, right? And then also allowed to, it's not even about, so sometimes she's experimenting, other times she's observing, right? And really trying to figure out like, what part of these roles, right? What part of these roles is she willing to take on, leave behind, tolerate? Is she attracted to, right? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure that's a question.
Well,
It's an observation.
I think this reflects like, I think she's confused in fact, because
Yeah,
at the beginning, she wants to not have to perform gender at all. She thinks that she's sort of upset. You mentioned earlier when we were talking before this evening about, she goes shopping with Crystal and,
yeah.
they're buying this and that. She's always
Mhm.
kind of pushing back and saying, I don't want to dress that way. I don't want to be read as mask. I don't
Right.
want to have to, fit into a scripted identity.
Hmm.
But at the same time, there's this problem of sort of illegibility, and I don't know who I am. Those are two different questions, but they both have problems attached to them because one has to figure out who one is, and can one do that outside of scriptedness?
Hmm.
Same being true of legibility. Sure, it's really great to think that nobody can define me from the outside, but if I'm completely illegible, then who am
Yeah.
I?
Right.
And I think, you mentioned the Hamilton Lodge Ball. I mean, it's the ultimate, I think, spectacle.
Hmm.
And it's the ultimate measure of the extent to which the queer craze was mainstreamed.
Yes.
And that's double-edged as well, because you have, isn't it wonderful to be mainstreamed? Isn't it wonderful? I said to you before, it's like, RuPaul's Drag Race. But
Hmm.
there's always, number one, there's always a backlash
Right.
potentially with the mainstreaming. That's not our problem, but we have to figure out how to deal with the problem because it's inevitable. And we're in
Hmm.
that again. So there's the problem of backlash, but also with reference to mainstreaming. And I think this is maybe true of the Harlem Renaissance too. You will tell, we can talk about that,
Hmm.
but that the mainstreaming also, it also eventually sort of waters everything down, if not
Yeah.
appropriates, the original value of the thing that you were trying to express. And I think that's part of what's happening at the Hamilton Lodge Ball. I mean, you had 8,000 people there of all different stripes, of all,
All
fancy
races,
social life. Yeah,
classes. Yeah, it was incredible.
right. And
Right.
so that's, phenomenal. And in some ways, it's unprecedented, I think, in American history in
I
terms
think so
of,
too.
yeah. But then again, it has this sort of darker side
Right.
because there's a lot of, if we could read passages from that, and that it's actually something that Langston Hughes wrote about, I think, very eloquently, that
Mhm.
there's all these really complicated class dynamics and
Yeah.
racial dynamics that are, on the one hand, very erotic, for
Hmm.
example, but on the other hand, I think there are power plays that are dangerous, and they're going to finally manifest themselves in very dangerous ways.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I never really know how to read it. I mean, one of the things I think that's why, the Hamilton Lodge Ball comes up so much, right? When we think about the Harlem Renaissance, when we think about queer Harlem Renaissance, like partly because it is that container, right, for all of the kind of the power politics that are going on that are shooting many different ways, right? That it is this moment where kind of race, class, sexuality, probably nation. I haven't investigated that enough, right? Where all of those, it's like a crucible, right, of all of the sort of dynamics that make the moment really, really exciting in terms of, again, people breaking out of uh, acceptable, respectable modes of being, right? At the same time, right? That's still happening within certain kinds of other power structures, that some of which are interracial and some of which are intraracial, right? So it's this incredible moment where some of the queerest people in the Harlem Renaissance are not able to participate in the queerness of the event, right? Or but white socialites are, it's just a bizarre, it becomes a kind of like fascinating event because it contains all of these issues about seeming and being, right? And power, right? That Henry notices, right? I think when she's there. A different set of things happen for her when she's in Coney Island, right? Or in Brooklyn, there's another kind of very pivotal moment in when she goes to a drag uh, performance in Brooklyn at the end of the novel, right, where a kind of different set of problematics happen when we see, right, yes, there seems a certain form of mainstreaming around all of this experimentation with gender and sexuality, right, but it's still being policed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that part of it's important, right, to have a representation of that. Of the potential liberation, and then also of the real dangers, right? That the real risks, right, that people took, right, to feel liberated in certain moments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that you said we'll talk about the circus, but that when you said, maybe even nation at the Hamilton Lodge Ball,
Mm-hmm.
and I was sort of recently brushing up on my butler for our event, for our conversation, and she said an attack on gender is an attack on democracy. More recently because of what's happening.
Yeah.
And, this is the thing. And I go back to Woolf because, it starts with these individual events or these individual places, and it just ripples out and it
Mm-hmm.
gets as big as it could get. And the biggest thing you can get to is fascism. And that's basically the ultimate repercussion of this, which is borne out in that historical moment and in our historical moment. And in both cases, of course, you have particular people in the crosshairs. It's always the same people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about misogyny and racism and queer phobia.
Yeah.
So the point of this book for me was, as you know, I wrote the first book 25 years ago, and I knew I was going to write, you can tell when you read the first book that there's going to be a sequel, but I didn't bother writing the sequel until the time came because
Yeah.
the time is now. And so it became necessary. And it really took that amount of time for us to get where we are again. And sort of in a weirdly coincidental way, it's literally 100 years later. And then, with reference to this idea of, to go back to what you said about how, is the goal in some ways performance without spectacle?
Mm-hmm.
It's ironic because in the case of the circus performers, and they are in that moment called freaks, and they call themselves freaks proudly.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the people in the room might know that film from the 30s called Freaks. It's
Yes.
a fantastic film.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the irony, because in some ways what she learns when she witnesses, they're actually friends. They become friends,
Yeah.
and she meets them through friends. So she sees the backstage,
Mhm.
people that they're not, that. But when she gets backstage, in some ways, they're the same people, and so there's a
Exactly.
kind of collapse of
Mhm.
what you would expect to be the most profound spectacle is the least potentially profound spectacle. And I'm going to read a little bit to that extent. What we learn from this is that, and we all know this, everybody performs their gender. It doesn't matter what gender you are, right?
Mhm.
And even when you mentioned earlier that, not this evening, but when we were talking, that, Henry dresses up in pearls to go to work.
Yes.
She's performing
Mhm.
femininity.
Yeah.
And at that particular historical moment in the 20s, it was very self-conscious, because there's actually an essay written in a psychoanalytic journal in 1929 by a guy named Riviere, who says that women were very self-consciously, straight women, so-called straight women, were
Mhm.
performing femininity because in the wake of the war, they had moved into
Right.
the labor market, and
Mhm.
men were very touchy about it, right? So they
Yeah.
were sort of overdoing these
Overdoing
ultra,
it. Right. Right.
feminine performances. So
Right.
anyway, back to the not so much performance.
Mhm.
She's with Frances, who is a half and half, so-called, and I'll read a little bit from that. Um, Her friend says it takes guts to do what Frances does, but she's not role playing. And Henry's like, "What does that mean?"
Yeah.
Our conversation was starting to hit a little too close to home. There's no telling how many of us were passing for one reason or another, in other words, performing some acceptable gender role.
Right.
Then there was me, a professional impersonator, not unlike Frances, who's the freak, only
Mhm.
I was pretending to be a jam straight, not a half and half. He wore a Medusa wig and a chest toupee. I wore pearls and heels. I found myself admiring Frances in a way. Josephine Joseph, the name of the performer on stage, was a role she could embrace without selling out. She
Mhm.
was calling the shots, after all. Playing roles on stage was one thing, playing them in real life quite another. We had no choice, did we? I suddenly felt the need to defend myself, to defend all of us.
Hmm. Wow, that's an amazing passage. I mean, it's so, I mean, there's another moment earlier in the book when, and I wrote this down when, I mean, a couple of times when I was reading, where um, Henry asks, I don't know if Henry asks herself or if somebody, if she's in her own med, and when she says, is she or isn't she? Is she or isn't she? Is she or isn't she? Right? And it's like that question, right? Of the relationship of the actor to the performance, of the actor to the audience, of the possible collapse of them. Again, like we get back to that, right? And it seems to be something that I think is related, right, to the way that Henry wants to or feels like she might have to or get to, right, express her gender. There also seems to be something like even even sort of further, I think, interior to that, right? That I think is actually really, yes, it's about gender. Yes, it's about her. It's not, I mean, she's clear about her sexuality. And I mean, the question is, how is she
Yeah,
going to be in the world? Right.
yeah,
And that question is related to gender, but I don't think it's only there. Right. There's some other thing that she's trying to figure out. And that's when she goes, when you have that other moment on Coney Island, when she goes to when she's in the water, right? And she has this moment where she feels, I mean, uh, she kisses her girlfriend, and she has this moment of sort of, I think it's important that it's in the water because it's almost as if like it's not you say unscripted body, but it's almost like unbodied, right? Which I think is sort of, there's something kind of elemental and human, right? That she's trying to get to as well.
yeah. I think it might go back to the idea when it's interesting you use the word interior. It's sort of like in the deepest sense of, who am I?
Yeah,
And
it's
is that
soul.
possible? Yeah.
It's
Is that
soul.
possible without, the answer is yes, it's possible in this
Yeah.
book anyway. without the scriptedness. And in that passage that you're describing, in an almost corny way, it gets very transcendental.
Yeah.
And it's to use,
Yeah.
I mean, in
Oversoul.
literally, right?
We're an oversoul.
Exactly. And I think that's what, and that is the soul, right? That is, and that is what we're after. But again, one is thrust back into the binary with, well, what about the body and the soul? And how do you really collapse those things finally in the real world, in a material world?
Yes.
And this is the thing that we keep butting up against, right? Is that we can transcend as much as we like, but when you're living in a political world, and you're living in a binary world, we keep getting thrust back in it. So the minute they exit the water, right, they get back up on land, boom, everything comes crashing back down again.
Yeah. Okay. We have some questions, but I have one final question for you. That's really related to what you just said, right? What it means to kind of come out of the water, right? And be kind of confronted with all of this. I think I keep thinking about it in terms of clothing. It's like you got to put your clothes back on, right?
Yeah.
In some ways, right? Like there's a kind of nakedness that you can't live in, right? And that you have to put the clothes back on. So, and you mentioned this earlier when you were talking about the fact that you waited to write this book and you wanted to write it in some ways right now, right? One of the things that we want to get to, I think, when we have these conversations is like, what's important about this book for this moment, right? What it's forms of activism. I'm also trying to think about the relationship of sort of like, literature to activism, right? To thinking about like how do we fill ourselves up with things right now that will help us to sort of manage this moment, right? So can you say a little bit about how you see Craze, right? How you see how Craze can be useful, right? I mean, in terms of like if you thought it could be useful, but how it can be useful in some ways right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer, partly because I'm a 60s person, that, art and popular culture and fashion and music is we know it's political, but I think it's also a very effective protest. And there's just a form of militancy if it's practiced properly. And I think, of course, I was writing it because of this 100-year anniversary of the rise of fascism, but I think we're in our particular moment, then we have to bring the sort of the lessons of the novel forward. And at the end of the novel, there's this scene where they meet literally at the end, and they found this activist movement called the QRP. And, Crystal, of course, is making a kind of campy joke saying it's queers rule the planet, but it's really the Queer Rights Project. And it's a fantasy because, in my opinion, we failed the test last time. And I think we were, in my reading of this history, there were aberrations, but we were kind of thrust back into the closet for 35 years. It was a disaster, let alone what happened during the Holocaust to all of us, basically, the people in this room, who came from these marginalized groups. So I think we have to figure out, like, what do we do this time around? How can we be more effective? And I think we're up against something that they were not up against, because at that time, homosexuals, as we understand them, were not invented yet. I think, there are various incarnations of what it means to be gay.
Yeah.
And so they were coming together, that's the fantasy at the end, because they weren't really there yet to where they could sort of have a united front, but it was starting to percolate in some ways. And yet here now, where we have certainly, post Stonewall, we've seen our power in numbers. We've seen that our militancy can be effective, but in some ways, I think that identity politics can have a potentially negative effect on coalition building.
Yeah.
So we have to figure out, that's one of the things that we have to figure out how to navigate. And then to really kind of return to this idea that, and that's where I think, your book is very important to me, is that the idea that somehow fashion itself can be a form of militancy.
Hmm.
And you wrote,
And solidarity.
yeah, and right, and community building. I mean, which
Yeah.
is what we're doing tonight. I think Sue Haley said that's part of the point
Yeah.
of the Lavender Literary Book Club. And I think you wrote about Looking for Langston, the film, and there's an Essex Hempel quote that I'm just gonna it's a poem that you know well, The Edge.
Yeah.
And I just want to quote two lines from it because I think it's sort of what I'm trying to get at. And it is, yes, we have to be militant in the streets. Yes, we have to have skin in the game. But also, quote, Essex Hempel, I am a revolution without bloodshed. I change the order of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where, what is this book trying to do? It's trying to sort of foreground the idea that there are many kinds of revolution,
Mm-hmm.
and that we have to all figure out what is our particular
Right.
brand of it, and we have to practice it as actively as we can.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Oh my goodness. I mean, thank you for bringing Essex Hemphill back into the conversation. The other day when I was I think it was a couple of months ago, there was a one of his poems on the subway, in the subway. I
Really
was just sort of like, oh my goodness, Essex Hemphill in the subway. I was just
amazing.
I mean, it's amazing. And I was just
Love it.
I wanted to say to everybody in the car, like, do you understand what this means? Like, you need to read this poem, right? And actually really think about it, right? And to know like what it like what it took to get Essex into the subway,
That's
right?
amazing.
Right? And I was just sort of like, I wanted to just like give a lecture right there, but I was just like, no, I was just like, I'm going to read this and just like take it into, take it in, right?
Yeah.
And do exactly what you're suggesting, which is like take it in and then figure out how to move that outward, right? In ways that people can be most effective. Yeah. Okay. We have some questions. Um, okay, here's the first question, Margaret. Um, did you think of Craze as historical fiction, a romance, or a combination of both?
Historical fiction.
Why not a romance?
um, because it's too leathery.
What
I
does
mean,
that mean?
well,
You know?
it's too. I obviously have a relatively my romance is not my genre. It's not my
You wrote a
take.
love story, but keep going.
Yeah, yeah. But I think I'm talking about romance as genre. I mean, there's a
Okay.
lot of there's a lot of sexuality in it,
Yeah.
but I think of the sexuality in this book as being very, again, militant and
Hmm.
disruptive. And I think of romance as a non-disruptive genre, but I could be wrong.
You could be wrong. You could be wrong. I mean, I think there are lots of, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, queer romance out there right now
Yeah, yeah.
that is disruptive,
Good.
right?
We're moving in the right direction.
Okay. All right. Leathery. I'm still going to think about what you said.
No, I got that from you.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Anyway, here's another question. Okay. This is for both of us. How do you both see how clothing and class are interacting in the novel as well as in the Harlem Renaissance? What do these self-stylizations mean for people who weren't necessarily ultra wealthy or socialites? And does that change how we think about style and fashion? Okay. I mean, I wanted to bring up that moment where there's some beautiful clothing moments in your book, right? So there's the moment when Henry puts on the pearls, right? The pearl set to go into her job, where she's just like, her boss is a man who needs to feel that he's in control of women, right? So she's like, I'm just going to go in here so that he can read this and not worry about me, right? That's a beautiful moment. But then there's also a couple of beautiful moments of shopping, right? So there's a great moment when they go to a secondhand store. It's in the Village, I think, right? And Henry's trying on suits um and then there's another moment where she's trying on secondhand suits, right? She's trying to, dress up to go to this speakeasy. Um, and then there's another moment though when they're about to go to the Hamilton Lodge Ball where they go to Fifth Avenue, right? And they walk into a really, like I think it's you don't say it's Bergdorf's, but I'm thinking it's Bergdorf's. They go into there and then Henry pretends to be buying a suit for her husband, right? And she's pretending that they're the same size, so trying it on, right? And doesn't realize at the time that the person who is selling her the suit is in cahoots with Crystal, and they're just basically making fun of her for trying to pretend that she's not buying the suit for herself, right? A tuxedo, actually. She's buying a tuxedo at that moment. Um, those moments in the book are really important to this question, right? About clothing and class, right? I mean, we already talked about the tuxedo and the way that that tuxedo sort of is able to kind of move things around and keep identity dynamic, right? When I think about fashion, right, and I think this is why your novel does this well, I think about it much more in terms of style, right? The fact that Henry, on the one hand, is going to this, I think it's called Glad Rags, right? In the Village, buying a secondhand suit there, and then also into Fifth Avenue, right? I mean, for her, she's thinking not only just about the appropriateness of the fashion to the style, but she's also like, and maybe it's Crystal because Crystal's driving this, right? As a stylist in some ways, right? Crystal's also thinking about like possibilities across, price points, right? Because she's just trying to she's trying to help Henry get to the place, right? Regardless of how much this fashion is costing, where she feels herself and or she's trying to get her to use this fashion as a tool,
Yeah.
right? As a tool, as a strategy. Sometimes that's for another audience, right? The tuxedo is to attract somebody, right? No, the suit is to attract somebody, whether that's like for another audience or, I mean, so I feel like there's so much what you're saying in the novel about fashion and style is really sort of about finding it's about the appropriateness is what you make of it, right? Not what society is telling you about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's actually in Slaves to Fashion. It's almost Henry Louis Gates. It's signifying. It's not what you're
Yeah,
wearing, it's how you wear it.
it's exactly
And
100%.
and there is a way
Is
in
she or
which,
isn't she?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah.
And the class thing is important because when she was in Paris, it was a very fancy, group of queers.
Yeah.
But when you get to New York in the 20s,
Yeah.
it
No.
doesn't mean that the class is not a factor, but it cuts both ways, and there's so much slumming going on because
Mhm.
prohibition backfired and all the hoity-toits are sort of thrust into the places where
Yes.
there isn't money in
Yeah.
effect. And so that's another leveler, is that the
Yeah.
prohibition cuts through the problem of class. And in
Yeah.
some ways, again, it does cut both ways, but that respectability, and I think you wrote about this in terms of the Harlem Renaissance, that respectability can actually be something that it's not a form of mobility, but rather it works against you in this
Oh,
regard.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, 100%. And it's like what's interesting about the Harlem Renaissance and this question, right, is that there's queerness throughout, right? I mean, there's the blues clubs and speakeasies, right, where certain sort of sartorial signals, right, are being
Hmm.
sent, right? And there's queerness, right, in the top, in the talented 10th or even the
Yeah.
1%, right? I mean, it's like those are the architects of the Harlem Renaissance. They also, so yeah, I mean, what you're saying about where it's located in terms of class, right? It's threaded, right? And in this moment, right, in the 1920s, um, obviously, like openly, I would say to a certain extent, threaded, right? Where people were able to recognize the queerness of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a different way. Okay, I'm just saying, okay, I'm checking the questions. Okay, I think we're good. I'm going to hand it back to Suali.
Thank you both. That was such a beautiful conversation. I feel like I was in here with my notepad, really studying all of the wisdom that you were both putting down. So this is definitely a recording that we could come back and study and listen to. And I'm sure a lot of the attendees will feel the same way and help us to spread the word about your conversation. So thanks again for joining us. I'm so happy to know that this was a conversation that was wanting to be had for many years.
Totally.
Yes.
Yeah, and that we
Thank
could
you, Mick, for making it happen after all
I know.
these
Yeah,
years.
thank
absolutely.
you.
What a pleasure. Thank you. It was the honor was ours. Thanks to everyone for joining us this evening for this edition of Lavender Literary Society Book Club. If you haven't yet, please order your copy of Margaret's book, Craze. We do have partners in LA at Rep Club Bookstore, and they offer a 10% discount to Lavender Literary Society members. So if you go over to their website and you use the code Lavender10 at checkout, you get 10% off of your book. So that's exciting. And I hope you'll join us for upcoming programs, including the next edition of Lavender Literary Society on April 24th in New Jersey, where we'll cover Queer Newark, Stories of Resistance, Love, and Community by Whitney Strub. That will happen at Project for Empty Space in Newark, New Jersey. So for anybody joining us from New Jersey, we're coming your way. So please come through. In the meantime, I invite you to follow the museum on social, subscribe to our newsletter to have all the latest on our upcoming public programs and other special initiatives. Thanks again to Monica and Margaret for a really exciting conversation. Good evening, and we look forward to welcoming you to upcoming programs at the American LGBTQ+ Museum. Good night. Thanks.
Not at all. Thanks.
Thank you.